The late afternoon sun hung heavy over the Ohio suburb of Crestwood Hills, casting a syrupy, golden heat over the manicured lawns. It was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the asphalt and turned the breeze off the nearby reservoir into a humid sigh. At the Hayes estate, however, it seemed nature itself had been brought to heel. The grass was cut to a uniform, military length. The hedges were sculpted into unnatural geometric globes, and guests moved through the gardens like pieces on a chessboard of money and pretense. The air was thick with expensive perfume, grilling filet mignon, and the loamy scent of the Midwest soil, an oppressive combination in the humid air. Jack stood near the edge of the stone patio, his back against a marble column, watching the scene with eyes that had seen too much of the world's dark side to be impressed by its glitter. At 32, Jack Callahan was a man carved from granite and silence. His broad shoulders strained the fabric of his dark polo shirt, and his posture was not stiff but ready, like a coiled spring. He was a Navy SEAL, a warrior currently navigating the strange waters of high society, and he felt more out of place here among the champagne flutes than he ever had in the desert. Beside him was Sergeant Major Kowalski, a man in his late 60s with a steel wool crew cut and a spine that refused to bend to age. Kowalski was retired, a legend in the Marine Special Operations community and the best friend of Jack's late father. He was the only reason Jack was here. The sergeant major took a slow sip of his drink, the ice clinking softly, and leaned slightly toward the younger man. "Appreciate you coming, son," Kowalski said, his voice a low gravel that cut through the party's frivolous chatter. "I know this ain't your natural habitat. You look like a wolf trying to blend in with a flock of peacocks." Jack swirled the amber liquid in his glass, not drinking, his eyes habitually scanning the perimeter. "Got 7 days of leave left, Sarge," Jack replied quietly, his tone respectful but tinged with a dry, weary humor. "Standing around eating tiny sandwiches isn't the worst way to spend a Tuesday. Besides, my dad would have haunted me if I'd let you drive out here alone." Kowalski let out a short, dry laugh. "Your father was a good man, and a stubborn one. He'd have hated this party more than you do." The sergeant major flicked his chin toward the center of the lawn. "But Preston Hayes is persistent. He wants my consulting firm to endorse his new defense logistics company. Thinks a few war stories and some free shrimp will buy my signature." Jack's gaze fell on their host. Preston Hayes was a man in his 40s who wore his wealth like a costume. He was soft in the middle, with a handsome, purchased face, but his eyes were small and mean, constantly darting around to see who was paying attention to him. Beside him was his wife, Beatrice, a woman who looked as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. She was draped in silk and diamonds, gesturing with her hands as she spoke, her laugh ringing out too loud and too brittle in the open space. Preston spotted them and excused himself from his circle of admirers, striding over with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sergeant Major. And this must be the young warrior you mentioned," Preston boomed, clapping the older man on the shoulder with a familiarity that made Jack's jaw tighten. "Welcome to my humble home. I trust the service is up to your standards." Jack looked at Preston, his face a blank mask, his eyes reading the man's insecurity beneath the bluster. "Service is fine, Mr. Hayes," Jack said, his voice flat. Preston laughed, a hollow sound. "Ah, well, we can't control the sun, can we? Not yet, anyway. Money can do a lot, but even I haven't figured out how to bribe Mother Nature." He turned back to the sergeant major, dismissing Jack as if he were a piece of furniture. "Now, about that contract, Kowalski, I was thinking we could discuss logistics over a cigar later. My company is poised to revolutionize the supply chain." Meanwhile, on the far side of the lawn, the party's invisible machinery was struggling to keep up. Clara, a 22-year-old server with bruised violet eyes and hands calloused from hard work, was balancing a heavy silver tray of crystal glasses. She was small and slender, her black and white uniform a size too big, making her look even more fragile. Sweat trickled down her back, but she kept her head down, moving with the practiced invisibility of someone who knew her survival depended on not being noticed. "Just keep moving, Clara," she whispered to herself. "Just 2 more hours, then you can go check on him." Her heart wasn't at the party. It was tucked away in the tiny, stifling servants' quarters behind the main garage, where a 4-month-old German Shepherd puppy named Max was waiting. Max was all paws and ears, a clumsy ball of fur Clara had bought with her meager savings from a roadside seller 2 weeks prior. He was her only family, her secret joy in a life that had been stripped of everything after her parents died. "You, girl." Beatrice Hayes's knife-sharp voice cut through the air. Clara froze, then quickly turned, weaving through the guests toward the patio where her employer was holding court. "Yes, ma'am. Do you need more champagne?" Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly. Beatrice glared at her, pointing a manicured finger at an empty glass. Obviously. And try to be quicker about it. You move like you're wading through mud. Do we pay you to crawl? Clara hurried forward, her eyes on the ground. I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll refill it right away. As she stepped onto the patio, her foot caught on an uneven flagstone, a tiny, imperceptible flaw in the perfect estate. She stumbled. She tried to right herself, but the heavy tray tipped, a single glass of red wine slid from the edge. It seemed to fall in slow motion, tumbling through the air before shattering against the hem of Beatrice Hayes's pristine white designer dress. The crimson liquid splashed, staining the silk like a gruesome wound. The garden fell silent. The music seemed to stop. Beatrice stared down at her dress, her face turning an ugly shade of plum. You fool! She shrieked, a raw, ugly sound that stunned every guest. You clumsy, stupid little nothing. Do you have any idea what this cost? It's worth more than your entire life. Clara dropped to her knees, shaking, grabbing at napkins to dab at the hem. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Hayes. Please, I didn't mean to. I can get it out. I promise. Beatrice didn't wait for an apology. Fueled by public humiliation and sheer arrogance, she swung her hand. The slap echoed in the silence like a pistol shot. It caught Clara across the cheek, sending her sprawling backward onto the stone patio. Get out! Beatrice screamed. You're fired. Get off my property before I have you arrested for destruction of property. Clara sobbed, covering her face. The guests stared, mouths agape, but did nothing, stunned by the sudden violence. But someone else had heard the cry. From the direction of the garage, a small, dark shape came barreling out. Max had squeezed through the loose latch on the servant's room door, drawn by the distress of the only person he loved. The puppy galloped clumsily across the lawn, his oversized paws slipping on the grass, letting out a series of high, valiant barks. He wasn't attacking. He was rushing to comfort. He planted himself between Clara and Beatrice, growling with all the menace a 4-month-old puppy could muster. Preston Hayes strode forward, his face a mask of annoyance. What in the hell is this? He roared. Whose mud is this? Get it out of here. Clara reached out a trembling hand. No, Max, come here. Please, sir. He's mine. He's just a baby. Don't hurt him. Preston sneered, looking down at the small animal blocking his path. Yours? I don't allow vermin on my property. As Max stood his ground, trembling but determined to protect Clara, Preston drew his foot back. I said, move. With a grunt, he kicked the puppy, his polished dress shoe connecting with the small dog's ribs. Max yelped, a heartbreaking sound of pain that echoed off the garden walls, and was flung through the air, landing in a heap in a thorny rosebush several feet away. Preston adjusted his suit jacket, preparing to kick the animal again to silence its whimpering. Filthy animal, he muttered, raising his foot for a second strike. Then the air changed. Jack didn't run. He glided. One moment he was by the column, the next he was a solid wall of muscle between Preston and the dog. He didn't shout, didn't strike. He simply caught Preston's airborne leg with one hand and grabbed his shoulder with the other. With a fluid twist of his hips, a basic and brutal SEAL takedown technique, he torqued. Preston's balance vanished. The wealthy man spun and slammed face first into the manicured lawn, his arm twisted behind his back in a joint lock that pushed his shoulder to its limit. Preston screamed, a pathetic, gurgling sound. My arm. You're breaking my arm. Do you know who I am? Jack leaned down, his mouth inches from Preston's ear. The crowd was frozen. Jack's voice was low, like thunder on the horizon, meant only for Preston and those nearest to hear. I don't care who you are, Jack whispered, the words cold and hard as steel. A man who hits a woman is a coward, but a man who hurts a defenseless animal forfeits his right to mercy. He applied a fraction more pressure to Preston's wrist, eliciting another pained squeal. If you ever touch either of them again, Jack continued, I won't be this gentle. Do you understand? Preston mumbled into the dirt. Yes. Yes. Let go. Jack released him and stood, smoothing his shirt as if he'd just brushed off a piece of lint. He walked to the rosebush, ignoring the thorns that tore at his expensive slacks. He knelt and gently scooped up the whimpering puppy. Max, terrified, licked Jack's chin. Jack then offered a hand to Clara. Can you get up? He asked softly. Clara looked up at him, her cheek red and swelling, her eyes wide with disbelief. I think so, she stammered. She took his hand, and he pulled her to her feet with an easy strength that made her feel safe for the first time in years. Preston scrambled to his feet, red-faced and sputtering, screaming for security. Did you see that? He shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Jack. He assaulted me. Sergeant Major Kowalski, did you see what your guest did? The old Marine set his glass down on a table with a definitive click. He looked at Preston with cold disappointment. I saw everything, Preston, Kowalski said, his voice carrying across the silent garden. I saw a man kick a puppy, and I saw a soldier stop him. The sergeant major adjusted his tie and looked Preston square in the eye. You can forget about that contract. My firm doesn't do business with men of your character. He gave a single nod to Jack, a soldier's salute to a righteous act. Get them out of here, son, Kowalski said. Jack nodded, and with the girl steady on one arm and the injured dog in the other, he turned his back on the sputtering billionaire. Let's go, Jack said to Clara. You're not staying here another minute. They walked toward the exit, leaving the broken crystal, the spilled wine, and the shattered reputation of the Hayes behind them in the suffocating afternoon heat. The gravel crunched under Jack's heavy boots as he carried the wounded German shepherd away from the manicured perfection of the Hayes estate. Clara walked beside him, her breaths coming in short, shallow gasps, her trembling hands clutching the hem of her apron. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the distant, panicked whispers of the guests they'd left behind and the steady, pained whimpers of the puppy in Jack's arms. They reached his truck, a restored 1985 Ram 2500, which stood out like a sore thumb among the gleaming Ferraris and Mercedes lining the drive. It was a beast painted in matte charcoal with a suspension lifted high enough to clear desert rock and tires that looked like they could chew through concrete. This truck wasn't a status symbol. It was a tool, maintained with the same obsessive precision Jack applied to his rifle. He didn't unlock it with a fob. He used a key, the metal turning with a satisfying, mechanical click. Get the passenger door, Jack instructed, his voice calm and steady, an anchor in Clara's panic. She obeyed, her small fingers fumbling with the handle before pulling the heavy steel door open. Jack gently laid Max on the bench seat, which was covered with an old but clean saddle blanket. The inside of the truck smelled of old leather, gun oil, and stale coffee, a masculine, grounding scent, a world away from the cloying floral perfume of the garden party. Get in, he told Clara. Hold his head. Keep him calm. As Clara climbed in, cradling the puppy's head in her lap, Jack walked around the truck, his eyes making one last sweep of the perimeter. He knew men like Preston Hayes, this humiliation wouldn't be the end of it. It was just the catalyst. Hayes was the kind of man who used phones and lawyers as weapons, and the counter-assault would be swift. Jack climbed into the driver's seat, the engine turning over with a deep, throaty rumble that vibrated through the frame. He didn't peel out of the driveway. He drove with a deliberate, controlled speed, guiding the massive truck onto the main road leading out of Crestwood Hills. 10 minutes later, once they were clear of the wealthy suburb and the immediate danger of private security, Jack pulled the truck onto a wide shoulder overlooking a stretch of farmland. The cornfields below were restless in the evening breeze. We need to stabilize him before we go any further, Jack said, shifting the truck into park and killing the engine. He reached behind the seat and pulled out a tactical medical kit. It wasn't a common drugstore first aid box. This was a field trauma kit, organized and stocked for a war zone. Jack switched on the dome light, illuminating the cab. Hold him steady, he murmured to Clara. His large, scarred hands moved with a surprising delicacy. He began a systematic assessment of the puppy, his fingers probing through the fur to check for fractures and internal bleeding. I'm checking for crepitus, Jack explained, his voice professional but gentle, giving her the technical details to keep her focused on the process instead of the fear. It's a grating sound or sensation produced by friction between bone and cartilage. If his ribs are broken, we need to know before the suspension jostles him too much. He pressed lightly along Max's side. The puppy whimpered, his tail giving a weak thump against the seat. Good boy, Jack whispered. I know it hurts. He pulled a stethoscope from a pouch, a surprising item for a soldier, but Jack believed in being prepared for everything. He listened to the dog's chest. Heart rate's elevated, which is normal with shock and pain. Lungs sound clear, no fluid buildup, so no punctured lung. That's good news. He produced a roll of vet wrap and a SAM splint, a pliable strip of aluminum coated in foam. I'm going to wrap his torso to support the ribs. It's a compression wrap. It'll restrict his breathing a little, but it keeps the broken ends of the bone from moving and puncturing anything vital. He worked efficiently, molding the splint to the dog's side and wrapping it securely, but not too tightly. Capillary refill time is good, he noted, pressing on the dog's gums. He's a fighter. Clara watched him, her eyes wide, tears drying on her cheeks. You know how to do everything, she whispered, her voice full of awe and exhaustion. I thought he was going to die. Jack put the kid away. In the field, you learn to patch up anything that bleeds, he said simply. He looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time since the garden party. Why this dog, Clara? You risked your job. Maybe your safety for him. Clara looked down at Max, stroking his ears. He's not just a dog, she said, her voice cracking. My parents died in a car wreck 2 years ago. I lost the house. The insurance money went to paying off debt. I had nothing. I was sleeping in my car before Mrs. Hayes hired me. I bought Max because I needed something to come home to, something that didn't care if I was poor or invisible. He's the only family I have left. If I lost him, I think I'd just disappear. Jack nodded slowly. He understood that, the single tether that kept a person from drifting into the abyss. For him, it was the mission and the memory of his father. For her, it was this broken puppy. He's not going to die, Jack promised, a vow as solid as the truck's steel frame. And you're not going to disappear. He started the engine again, pulling back onto the highway. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in bruised streaks of purple and orange, but the peace was momentary. Back at the estate, Preston Hayes was pacing in his study, a scotch in one hand and his phone in the other. His face was blotchy with rage. I don't care who he is, Hayes shouted into the phone. He assaulted me on my own property and stole my dog. That animal is worth $5,000. It's a champion bloodline. I want him stopped. I want him in cuffs. If you let him leave the county, Sheriff, I will make sure your next campaign is funded in pocket change. He slammed the phone down, his chest heaving. He didn't care about the dog. He'd probably have had it put down the next day. But he cared about winning. He cared that some nameless soldier had made him look weak. Jack saw them before he heard them. Flashing red and blue lights blossomed in his rearview mirror, cutting through the twilight. A patrol car was gaining on them, sirens screaming. Up ahead, the road narrowed as it curved through a pass, a choke point between rocky bluffs and dense forest. Another patrol car was parked sideways, blocking the way. Is that for us? Clara asked, panic rising in her throat. She held Max tighter. They're going to take him. They're going to give him back to Preston. Stay in the truck, Jack said, his voice shifting into a command tone. Keep your hands where they can be seen. Don't get out unless I tell you. He slowed the truck, bringing it to a stop a dozen yards from the roadblock. A young deputy stepped out from behind the police cruiser, his hand resting nervously on his sidearm. This was Deputy Reynolds, a man in his 20s with a fresh haircut and a uniform that looked a size too big. He looked like someone trying to be brave but terrified of making a mistake. Driver. Reynolds shouted over the PA system. Kill the engine. Place your hands outside the window. Jack complied slowly. He turned the engine off but left the key in the ignition. He rolled down the window and placed his large, open hands outside. Reynolds approached cautiously while the officer from the rear car provided cover. Step out of the vehicle slowly, Reynolds ordered. Jack opened his door and stepped out. He was a full head taller than the deputy. He didn't slouch or cringe. He stood at parade rest, radiating a calm authority that made Reynolds hesitate. I am Commander Jack Callahan, United States Navy, Jack announced, his voice carrying clearly over the wind. I am currently transporting a critically injured animal to an emergency veterinary clinic under the Good Samaritan law regarding the prevention of animal cruelty. Reynolds blinked, thrown off his script. Sir, we had a report of an assault and grand larceny from a Mr. Preston Hayes. He claims you stole his dog and attacked him. The dog belongs to the young woman in the passenger seat, Jack stated, his eyes unwavering. Mr. Hayes assaulted the animal, causing severe trauma. I performed an exigent rescue to save its life. If you delay us, deputy, and this animal dies, you will be an accessory to animal cruelty. Furthermore, I am currently on active duty leave, and detaining me without a warrant based on the word of a man who was just publicly disgraced by Sergeant Major Frank Kowalski may not be the career move you want to make. Reynolds faltered. The mention of Sergeant Major Kowalski, a local war hero, struck a nerve. Sergeant Major Kowalski was there? Reynolds asked, his hand relaxing on his sidearm. He was, Jack confirmed. And if you'd like to verify my story, you can ask him. In fact, Jack slowly reached into his pocket. I have him on speed dial. Or perhaps your sheriff has already received a call. As if on cue, the radio on Reynolds' shoulder crackled to life. It was the sheriff, his voice sounding tired and annoyed. Reynolds, stand down. I just spoke with Sergeant Major Kowalski. He's confirmed the commander's story. Hayes is blowing smoke. Let them go. Reynolds looked at the radio, then at Jack, and finally at the terrified girl cradling the bandaged puppy in the truck. The young deputy let out a breath he'd been holding. He respected the uniform, and he knew Preston Hayes' reputation for bullying. "You're free to go, Commander," Reynolds said, stepping back and signaling the other car to move. "But for the record, I didn't see a dog. I just saw a soldier taking a walk." Jack gave a nod, a rare glint of respect in his eyes. "Thank you, Deputy. You're a good man." Jack climbed back into the truck. Clara was shaking, tears of relief streaming down her face. "It's over now," Jack said softly as he put the truck in gear and drove through the now clear roadblock. "We're safe." As they drove into the deepening night, leaving the lights of Crestwood Hills behind them, the road ahead looked dark, but for the first time, it led somewhere safe. The headlights of the Ram 2500 cut through the gathering darkness, illuminating a weathered wooden sign that swung gently on a rusty chain. Havenwood Farm. It was a name that sounded peaceful to outsiders, but to Jack, it meant a sanctuary built on the bedrock of his family's resilience. The truck rumbled over a cattle guard and crunched up the long gravel drive, flanked by ancient oak trees whose branches formed a cathedral canopy overhead. The farmhouse at the end of the drive was a handsome, two-story structure painted a welcoming white, glowing like bone in the moonlight, with a wraparound porch that seemed to embrace the land itself. The engine died and the silence of the country rushed in, heavy with the sound of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. The porch's screen door creaked open and a figure emerged, wiping her hands on a floral apron. This was Martha Callahan, Jack's mother. She was a woman in her 60s, woven from the same durable fabric as the land she tended. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun, revealing a face deeply lined with the maps of laughter and hard seasons. She wore work boots instead of slippers, and her eyes, though warm, held the steel of a woman who had raised one warrior and buried another. Jack stepped out of the truck, his weariness momentarily forgotten at the sight of her. "Mom," he said, his voice softening. Martha came down the steps and pulled her son into a fierce hug, one that smelled of baking bread and rain. "You're late, Jack," she said, pulling back to study his face. "And you've brought trouble home. I can smell it on you like smoke." Jack gestured to the truck's cab where Clara sat, looking terrified, with Max sleeping fitfully in her lap. "Brought guests," Jack corrected gently. "They needed a safe harbor." Martha looked into the truck, her expression shifting instantly from stern to concerned as she saw the girl's bruised face and the bandaged dog. "Well, don't stand there letting the heat out," she commanded. "Get them inside." Inside, the kitchen was a warm fortress against the world, cluttered with canning jars, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and the comforting aroma of beef stew. Clara sat at the heavy oak table, clutching a mug of hot tea like it was a life raft. Max was settled on a rug near a wood-burning stove. As Jack checked the puppy's vitals, Martha leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "Preston Hayes called the house an hour ago," she said quietly, dropping the news like a stone in a pond. "He didn't know you were coming here specifically, but he was screaming about a soldier and a thief. Threatened to burn us out, metaphorically speaking." Jack looked up, his eyes narrowing. "He's just making noise, Mom. He can't touch this land." Martha sighed, a sound that resonated deep in her chest. "It's more than noise, Jack. He's been sending letters for 6 months. Lawyers, surveyors, intimidation tactics. He wants the water rights from the creek for his new golf course project. He wants Havenwood. Bringing this girl here. It gives him the leverage he was looking for. He'll claim we're harboring a fugitive to pressure me into selling." The gravity of the situation settled over the room. The safe harbor was under siege. Before Jack could respond, a sound from the rug broke the moment. Max let out a high-pitched cry, his body arching unnaturally. The puppy began to heave violently, but nothing came up. Then his eyes rolled back and his limbs began to paddle the air in a terrifying rhythm. "He's having a seizure," Clara cried, dropping to her knees beside the dog. "Jack, help him." Jack was there in a second, moving a coffee table out of the way to keep the dog from hitting it. "It's the head trauma," Jack said, his voice taut. "The swelling is putting pressure on his brain. He needs something to bring the pressure down and a heavy sedative or his heart will give out." Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the eaves. A summer thunderstorm, violent and sudden, had rolled in off the plains. Thunder cracked like artillery, rattling the window panes. The kitchen lights flickered once, twice, then died, plunging them into darkness. "Lines must be down," Martha announced calmly from the shadows. "Jack, you can't drive him into town in this. The creek bridge will be washed out in 20 minutes." Jack clicked on his tactical flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark. "I'm not going to town," he said, grabbing his keys. I'm going to get Doc Miller. Doc Miller? Clara asked, looking up from the convulsing dog, her face illuminated by the harsh white light. Dr. Samuel Miller, Martha replied, moving to light an oil lamp. Lives 3 miles through the woods. He was a combat medic in Vietnam before he became a vet. He's the only one who can get here in time. Jack turned to Clara. Keep him warm. Don't put anything in his mouth. Talk to him. I'll be back. He vanished into the storm. The drive was a nightmare. The dirt road had turned into a river of mud. The ram fishtailed, fighting for traction, its wipers working furiously against the sheeting rain. Jack drove with a white-knuckled precision, fighting the elements just as he had fought in foreign lands. He reached a small, dilapidated cabin tucked into a grove of pine trees. He didn't knock. He pounded on the door. It opened to reveal Doc Miller. The doc was a man who looked as if he'd been carved from an old, gnarled tree, weathered and tough. He had a thick gray beard, one glass eye that didn't quite track with the other, and a limp from an old shrapnel wound. He was wearing a flannel shirt and a look of suspicion. Callahan. Miller grunted, squinting into the rain. What in the blue blazes are you doing out here? I need you, Doc. Jack yelled over the wind. Head trauma. Puppy, seizing. I need the bag. Miller didn't ask questions. He didn't ask for money. He simply turned, grabbed a worn leather medical bag from a hook, and limped out into the rain. The drive back was slower, the mud deeper. When they burst into the kitchen, bringing the wind and rain with them, Max was still seizing, his breath shallow and ragged. The barn, Miller barked, his raspy voice a command. Kitchen table's no good. I need room, and I'm not about to ruin your mother's floors. They carried the dog to the large barn out back. It was a cavernous space that smelled of hay and old oil. With the power out, it was pitch black. We need light. Miller yelled as he laid Max on a workbench covered with a clean tarp. Jack didn't hesitate. He backed the truck up to the open barn doors and switched on the high beams. 2 brilliant cones of light flooded the workspace, casting long, dramatic shadows against the wooden walls. Hold him, Miller ordered Jack. The old vet opened his bag, his hands steady despite his age. Pupils are dilated. Intracranial pressure is spiking. I need to push mannitol and start in 4. Clara hovered nearby, holding a flashlight to give Miller a better angle. Is he going to die? She whispered. Miller didn't look up. Not on my watch, little lady. I've pulled boys out of rice paddies with less hope than this. The 2 men worked in tandem, the young SEAL and the old medic. It was a ballet of discipline. Jack anticipated Miller's needs, handing him gauze, holding a vein, steadying the dog's thrashing head. There was a silent language between them, the brotherhood of men who have held life and death in their hands. He's fighting the sedative, Miller grunted, sweat dripping from his brow. He's got heart. Stubborn as you are, Jack. Miller found the vein and pushed the medicine. Slowly, agonizingly, the seizure subsided. Max's body went limp, his breathing deepening into a steady, though still ragged, sleep. Pressure's coming down, Miller announced, listening with his stethoscope. We're not out of the woods, but we found the path. The storm raged outside, beating on the barn's tin roof with a deafening roar, but inside the circle of the truck's headlights, there was a quiet calm. Jack wiped his hands on a rag, looking at the sleeping dog, then at Clara, who was weeping silently with relief, and finally at his mother, who had brought out a thermos of coffee. Martha looked at the group, the warrior, the orphan, and the wounded dog gathered against the darkness. Hayes wants a fight, Jack said quietly to Miller, his voice barely audible over the rain. He wants the farm. He's the one who hurt the dog. Miller put his syringes away, his glass eye glinting in the light. He looked at Jack, a fierce, protective grin spreading through his beard. Well, then, Miller growled. It's a good thing I never sold my rifle. Let him come. We'll teach him some things aren't for sale. The morning sun at Havenwood Farm didn't so much rise as spill, pouring like liquid gold over the rolling hills and burning the mist off the pasture grass. For the first time in days, the air was clean and clear, scrubbed by the storm. On the back porch, Max was learning to walk again. The German shepherd, his ribs still wrapped in the compression bandage Jack had applied, moved with a stiff, lopsided gait, but his tail, a ragged banner of resilience, wagged with an enthusiasm that defied his injuries. Jack sat on the steps, a mug of black coffee in his hands, watching the animal with a reserved affection. He wasn't just watching a dog. He was assessing a recruit. To Jack, survival wasn't a matter of luck, it was a matter of preparation. He set his mug down and stood, his shadow falling long across the wooden planks. Clara, he called softly to the girl, who was sweeping the porch. Leave the broom. It's time for a different kind of work. Clara hesitated, leaning the broom against the railing. She looked different than she had at the party. The bruise on her cheek was fading to a pale yellow, but her eyes were less haunted, though they still darted nervously at any sudden noise. She came over, wiping her hands on her apron. Is Max okay? She asked immediately, stooping to check on the dog. Max is healing, Jack corrected, his voice low and firm. But healing isn't enough. The world is full of sharp corners, Clara. If you don't know how to navigate them, you get cut. We're going to build discipline. In him, and in you. He motioned for her to stand. Shoulders back, he commanded, not unkindly, but with an authority that demanded compliance. When you slouch, you tell the world you're a target. Stand like you own the ground beneath your feet. Clara straightened her spine, feeling unnatural and exposed. Jack nodded. Better. Now, call him. Don't ask him to come. Command him. Clara looked at the puppy. Max, come here, she said, her voice rising at the end like a question. Max sniffed a dandelion, ignoring her. Jack crossed his arms. He's ignoring you because he doesn't believe you. Animals, like predators, smell hesitation. Try again. Lower your voice. Make it a declarative statement. Max. Here. Clara took a deep breath. She thought of Beatrice Hayes's slap. She thought of the fear in the truck. She pushed that fear down and found a small, hard kernel of anger beneath it. Max. Here. The command was firmer, deeper. The puppy's ears perked. He turned, looked at her, and trotted over, sitting clumsily at her feet. A rare, faint smile touched Jack's lips. Good. That's a start. In the teams, we have a saying, panic is the enemy. Fear is just data. You acknowledge the fear, you process the data, and you act. No freezing, just reflex. For the next few days, this became their ritual. Jack trained them not with the harshness of a drill sergeant, but with the patient repetition of a craftsman sharpening a blade. He taught Clara how to walk the farm's perimeter, how to check for broken fences, and how to listen to the silence of the woods for when something was wrong. He taught Max basic commands, sit, stay, heel, using hand signals, integrating the dog into a silent language of protection. As Clara's confidence grew, so did the atmosphere of the farm. The heavy blanket of anxiety began to lift. One afternoon, while Jack was splitting wood near the barn, the rhythmic thud of the axe echoing like a heartbeat, he heard a sound that made him stop mid-swing. It was a melody, drifting from the open kitchen window. Clara was washing dishes, and she was singing. It wasn't a pop song or a radio jingle. It was an old hymn. It is well with my soul. Her voice was high, clear, and pure, with a vibrato that spoke of a deep, old sadness and the hope that rises from it. Jack lowered the axe, leaning on the handle. He closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. For years, the only sounds he had known were the staccato burst of gunfire, the roar of helicopters, and the screams of dying men. Clara's voice was the antithesis of all that. It was soft, organic, and incredibly powerful in its fragility. It reminded him that there were things in this world worth fighting for. Things like beauty, and innocence, and peace. He realized that while he was teaching her the discipline of steel, she was teaching him the resilience of flowers, which can bloom even after being trampled. That evening, as dusk settled in shades of violet and gray, Doc Miller, the old vet, stopped by to check on Max's stitches. Satisfied with the progress, the doc settled into a rocking chair on the porch, nursing a bourbon Jack had poured for him. The two soldiers sat in the companionable silence that exists only between men who have seen death. Dog's got a hard head, Miller grunted, lighting a pipe. He'll make a fine guardian, but you know, Jack, a dog can't stop a lawsuit. Jack leaned against the railing, staring out at the darkening tree line. I know, he replied. Preston Hayes isn't done. The doc took a long pull from his pipe, the smoke curling up like a ghost. Men like Hayes, Miller began, his voice raspy, they don't fight with fists. They don't fight with honor. They fight with ink, with shadows, with money. He's been buying up the debt on the surrounding farms. He's choking the life out of this valley so he can build his playground. He sees you and that girl and that dog as variables he can't control. And rich men hate variables. Miller pointed the stem of his pipe at Jack. You can train that girl to stand up straight, and that's good. She needs that. But don't think for a second that physical strength is going to win this fight. You need to be smarter. You need to protect her not just from his hand, but from his reach. Jack nodded grimly. I'm not letting him take the farm, Doc. And I'm not letting him touch them. Miller chuckled grimly. Just remember, the most dangerous snake isn't the one that's rattling. It's the one waiting in the grass. The warning hung in the air as the night deepened. Hours later, the moon was obscured by drifting clouds. The farm was asleep, save for the nocturnal chorus of tree frogs. Suddenly, inside the house, Max lifted his head from his dog bed. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest. It wasn't the playful growl of a puppy. It was the deep, instinctual warning of a guardian. Clara, who had taken to sleeping on the nearby sofa, was instantly awake. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Max rose to his feet, the fur on his back standing on end, his gaze fixed on the back door. Clara didn't pull the covers up. She didn't immediately call for Jack. She remembered the lesson. Fear is just data. She slid off the sofa, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight Jack had placed on the end table. "Stay," she signaled to Max, though the dog was trembling with the need to charge. Clara crept to the back door and peered through the glass. At the edge of the yard near the tool shed, 2 flashlight beams were cutting through the darkness. 2 men. They were tampering with the fence line, the metallic snip of wire cutters carrying clearly in the stillness. Poachers, or hired thugs sent to deliver a message. Upstairs, Jack was already awake. He was a light sleeper, but before he could reach the landing, he heard the back door fly open. He froze, his hand on the banister, and watched. Clara stepped out onto the porch. She didn't back down. She raised the flashlight, aiming the brilliant, disorienting beam directly into the intruder's eyes. "Get off this property," she shouted. Her voice didn't break. It was loud, projected from her diaphragm, the same way she projected her singing voice. "We are armed, and we have a guard dog. Leave now." The 2 figures froze, blinded by the sudden light and startled by the ferocity in her voice. Max, unable to contain himself, shot past Clara, barking furiously, a sound far bigger than his frame. The intruders, perhaps expecting an easy target or an old woman, panicked. "Let's go. It ain't safe," one of them muttered. They scrambled back, tripping over their own feet, and vanished back into the tree line, their truck engine roaring to life moments later down the road. Clara stood on the porch, her chest heaving, the flashlight beam still cutting through the dark, making sure they were gone. She knelt and grabbed Max's collar, pulling him back to her side. "Good boy," she gasped, her legs finally beginning to shake as the adrenaline subsided. From the doorway behind her, Jack emerged. He hadn't intervened. He had been standing in the shadows, his combat knife in his hand, ready to unleash hell if they had taken one more step. But he had waited. He walked over to her now. Clara turned, looking at him, expecting him to be angry that she had taken the risk. Instead, Jack was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. It wasn't just relief, it was respect. "You didn't freeze," Jack said softly. "No," Clara replied, staring into the darkness where the men had been. "I didn't." Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of comradeship. "You did good, Clara. Real good." For the first time, the maid and the warrior stood not as protector and protected, but as allies holding the line. The peace that had settled over Havenwood Farm was fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep, dark lake, and it shattered at precisely 10:00 a.m. on a Tuesday. The car that crunched up the gravel drive was not a truck or a tractor. It was a gleaming black sedan with tinted windows that looked like a hearse arriving too early for a funeral. It stopped near the porch where Clara was shucking peas and Max was chewing on a thick rope toy. Jack was repairing a section of porch railing, his hammer stopping mid-swing as he watched the car door open. A man emerged, a figure who seemed entirely alien to the dust and sunlight of the farm. He was tall and thin, wearing a suit that cost more than the tractor in the barn, with hair slicked back so severely it stretched the skin of his scalp. He carried a leather briefcase like a weapon. This was Julian Vance, chief counsel for Hayes Enterprises, a man known in the county not for his courtroom oratory, but for his ability to bury opponents under mountains of paperwork before a trial ever began. Vance came up the steps, ignoring the low, menacing growl that rumbled from Max's chest. He didn't look at the dog or at Clara. His eyes were fixed on Martha, who had emerged from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. "Mrs. Callahan," Vance said, his voice smooth and sterile, devoid of any local warmth. "My apologies for the intrusion. I'm Julian Vance, representing Mr. Preston Hayes." Martha crossed her arms, her posture rigid. "I know who you are, Mr. Vance, and I know what you want. The answer is still no. The land is not for sale." Vance smiled, a thin, bloodless smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I'm not here about a real estate offer today, Mrs. Callahan. Not directly. I'm here to serve legal notice. He opened his briefcase and produced a thick sheaf of documents, handing them not to Martha, but to Clara. Clara took the papers, her hands shaking so badly the pages rustled like dry leaves. What is this? She whispered. That, Vance explained, is an official summons. Mr. Hayes is filing a suit against you, miss, for grand larceny. Specifically, the theft of a $5,000 purebred German Shepherd and a $50,000 diamond ring, which went missing from the master bedroom on the day of your dismissal. Clara gasped, the color draining from her face. A ring? I never took anything, and Max is mine. Vance raised a perfectly groomed eyebrow. Mr. Hayes has filed paperwork documenting the dog's pedigree. As for the ring, well, that will be for a jury to decide. Given your financial situation and your abrupt departure, it paints a rather grim picture. We're talking about a felony conviction. 10 years, perhaps. The silence on the porch was deafening. Jack stepped forward, placing himself between Clara and the lawyer. This is a lie, Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. You're fabricating evidence to intimidate a witness. Vance looked at Jack with feigned pity. Commander Callahan, is it? I'd be careful. Obstruction of justice is a serious charge for a military officer. Then Vance turned back to Martha, delivering the real attack of his visit. However, he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, Mr. Hayes is a forgiving man. He understands that young women make mistakes. If you, Mrs. Callahan, were to sign over the land for the creek and lower pasture rights at the fair market value we've previously offered, well, he would be inclined to drop all charges against your houseguest. He'd consider the ring simply misplaced and the dog could remain here. It was a masterfully cruel blow. He wasn't just attacking them, he was asking Martha to choose between her ancestral land and Clara's freedom. He was asking Clara to live with the guilt of causing Martha to lose her home. You have 24 hours to consider the settlement, Vance said, placing a business card on the railing, or the sheriff will be out here with a warrant for her arrest. He turned and walked back to his car, leaving the three of them standing in the wreckage of their morning. Clara dropped the papers, her face in her hands. I have to go, she sobbed. I can't let you do this, Martha. I can't let you lose your home because of me. Martha took Clara by the shoulders, giving her a gentle shake. Stop that. We don't trade people for land. Not in this family. But the universe had one more blow to deliver. As Vance's car disappeared down the drive, a vibration sounded in Jack's pocket. It was his secure satellite phone. He pulled it out, saw the caller ID, Navspacom. His stomach tightened. He walked to the edge of the porch and answered it. Callahan. He listened for a minute, his face setting into a mask of stone. Understood. I'll be there. He ended the call and turned back to the two women, who were watching him with dread-filled eyes. That was my CO, Jack said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Mission timeline's been moved up. My team is spinning up. I have to report to base for deployment in 48 hours. The timing was catastrophic. 48 hours. It meant he'd be on a transport plane halfway around the world when the sheriff came to arrest Clara. He'd be fighting enemies in the desert while Hayes destroyed his family here at home. For a moment, Jack felt a wave of helplessness he never felt in combat. In war, he had a rifle and a target. Here, the enemy was smoke and mirrors. He looked at Clara, terrified and crying. He looked at his mother, strong but cornered. He looked at Max, who was licking Clara's hand, oblivious that a piece of paper said he didn't belong to her. Jack realized he couldn't fight a legal war. He didn't have months for discovery and motions. He had 2 days. He needed a surgical strike. He needed the truth. I'm not signing that land over, Martha said defiantly. But her voice trembled. And you are not going to jail, Clara? Jack nodded. Nobody is signing anything, and nobody is going to jail. He walked past them into the house and up the stairs to his old bedroom. He opened the closet. Hanging there, preserved in a plastic garment bag, was his dress blue uniform. He didn't put on his camouflage. That was for hiding. He put on the blues. That was for making a statement about who he was. He fastened the buttons, their brass shining against the dark fabric. He pinned his metal ribbons, the bronze star, the purple heart, to his chest. Above them, he pinned the trident, the gold eagle and anchor that marked him as a SEAL. When he looked in the mirror, he didn't just see a man. He saw the embodiment of an oath. He walked downstairs. The sound of his polished dress shoes on the hardwood floor was heavy and rhythmic. Clara looked up and stopped crying. The sight of him in full uniform, radiating an aura of lethal competence and unshakable honor, took her breath away. He looked like something out of a myth, a god of war preparing for judgment. "Where are you going?" Martha asked. "Into town," Jack replied. "To end this." He drove the truck into the county seat, the engine rumbling with the sound of his own contained fury. He parked at the sheriff's department, ignoring the stares of the townspeople, who were unaccustomed to seeing him in his formal uniform. He walked through the front doors, the metals on his chest clinking softly. The deputy at the front desk sat up straighter. Jack went straight to the back office and opened the door without knocking. Sheriff Jim Brody was at his desk, staring at a stack of files, looking like a man who hadn't slept in a week. Brody was a good man, a family man, but he was tired, and the weight of local politics was heavy on his shoulders. Brody looked up, startled, then slowly rose to his feet out of respect for the rank and the uniform. "Jack," Brody said, sighing. "I heard Vance paid you a visit. Look, son, I don't like this any more than you do. Hayes has the county prosecutor in his pocket. If they file those charges, I have to serve the warrant. My hands are tied." Jack stood on the other side of the desk. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He spoke with the quiet, frightening intensity of a man with nothing left to lose. "Your hands are tied by paper, Jim. Mine are tied by an oath. I have deployment orders in 48 hours. I'm going to go fight for this country. I'm going to go bleed so men like Preston Hayes can sleep safely." Jack leaned forward, his knuckles on the desk. "But before I go, I'm going to find the truth. I know he's lying about the ring. I know he's lying about the dog. And I know he's blackmailing my mother." Brody looked down, unable to meet Jack's eyes. "Jack, without proof, it's just your word against the richest man in the county." Jack straightened, adjusting his cover. "Then I'll get you proof. I don't need a jury, Jim. I just need you to do your job when I bring it to you. Give me 48 hours. Don't let him bully you into serving that warrant until my time is up." Brody looked at the young commander, saw the burning conviction in his eyes. He thought about his own badge and what it used to mean. 48 hours, Brody agreed quietly. "But Jack, if you don't find anything, I have to take her in." "I'll find it," Jack said, turning to leave. "Because the alternative is me declaring a different kind of war on this town, and nobody wants that." The clock on the dashboard of Jack's Ram 2500 glowed a soft blue, marking the passage of time like a heartbeat slowing before death. 46 hours remaining. Jack had shed his dress blues, carefully hanging the uniform in the back of the cab, and had donned the attire of a ghost. Dark jeans, a nondescript gray hoodie, and boots that made no sound when he walked. He was no longer an officer appealing to the law. He was an operator, moving in the gray areas where the law often couldn't reach. He parked in the shadows of an alley behind a local dive bar called the Iron Horse Saloon, a haunt for off-duty cops, construction workers, and private security contractors. Jack wasn't here for a drink. He was here to hunt, using the oldest and most effective intelligence-gathering method in warfare, human intelligence. He took a sip of lukewarm coffee from a thermos, his eyes scanning the entrance. He was looking for one man, Rick Gunner Riley. Riley was a fixture in the county, a former Marine gunnery sergeant who'd seen the worst of it in Fallujah. Now, he was the head of security for Hayes Enterprises. He was a man built like a vending machine, square and immovable, with a face that looked like it had been carved from rock with a dull screwdriver. A jagged scar ran from his left ear to his jaw, a souvenir from an eye that should have killed him. Jack knew Riley by reputation. The man was hard, uncompromising, but he was known to possess a rigid, almost archaic code of honor that didn't always align with the flexible morals of his employer. Jack watched as a heavy steel door opened, and Riley stepped out into the cool night air for a smoke. The flare of a lighter illuminated a face deeply etched with fatigue and a simmering resentment. Jack got out of the truck. He didn't approach aggressively. He walked with his hands visible, palms open, the universal sign for a parley. "Evening, Gunner," Jack said, his voice low and even, cutting through the ambient noise of the street. Riley didn't flinch. His hand didn't drift toward the sidearm concealed under his jacket, but his eyes locked onto Jack with the precision of a targeting laser. He took a long drag from his cigarette and exhaled a plume of smoke. "Commander Callahan," Riley grunted, his voice like gravel in a cement mixer. "Heard you made quite a scene up at the boss's house. Breaking arms and stealing dogs. You're a popular topic on the radio tonight." "I didn't steal the dog," Jack corrected calmly. "And I didn't break his arm. I just reminded him of his limitations." He took another step, moving into the circle of a streetlight's glow. "I'm not here to fight you, Rick. I ship out in 2 days. But before I go, I need to know if the Marine Corps taught you to protect wife beaters and liars, or if that's just something you picked up in the private sector. It was a gamble, a direct challenge to the man's core identity. Riley's jaw tightened. He flicked the cigarette away. Watch your mouth, squid, Riley growled, but there was no real heat in it. A paycheck's a paycheck. I provide security. I don't judge the client's soul, but you judge the mission, Jack pressed. Hayes is framing an orphan for a felony she didn't commit. He's blackmailing my mother for her land. He's claiming the dog is his. You ran the security detail that day. You've seen the tapes. You know the truth. Riley was silent for a long moment, staring at the brick wall across from them. The cameras glitched, Riley recited mechanically, the lie tasting sour even in the air. That's the official report. Cloud server error. Jack shook his head. You and I both know his security system doesn't have server errors. You have redundant backups. You have local caches. Jack stepped into Riley's personal space, looking him square in the eye. I'm not asking you to betray your client. I'm asking you to honor the oath you took long before you put on that suit. Semper Fidelis, always faithful. To what, Rick? To a paycheck, or to the truth? While Jack was fighting his battle in the alley, another kind of war prep was happening at Havenwood Farm. The farmhouse, normally open and welcoming, had been transformed into a fortress. Martha and Clara worked in a quiet, urgent rhythm. They didn't board the windows, that would signal fear, but they were reinforcing locks and checking the perimeter lighting. Martha moved with a determined energy, organizing emergency supplies, flashlights, batteries, first aid, and her late husband's old double-barreled shotgun. She placed the weapon on the mantelpiece, not as a threat, but as a promise of protection. Clara was in the kitchen filling water jugs, her hands moving efficiently. She paused, looking at a framed photo on the wall, a picture of Jack as a young boy standing next to his father. I'm sorry, Clara whispered, her voice trembling. This is all my fault. If I hadn't come here. Martha stopped what she was doing. She walked over to Clara, her steps heavy on the pine floorboards. She took Clara's face in her hands, her palms rough and warm. You listen to me, child, Martha said fiercely. Preston Hayes has been circling this farm like a vulture for years. You didn't bring him here. You just gave us a reason to finally stand up and fight him. Martha reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small silver object. It was a brooch in the shape of a dove. My grandmother wore this through the Great Depression, Martha said, pinning it to Clara's collar. It reminded us that peace isn't the absence of trouble. It's the presence of spirit. You are part of this family now, Clara, and the Callahans do not run. Clara touched the cool metal of the pin, tears welling in her eyes. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just a servant or a victim. She was a daughter of the house. 2 hours later, the neon sign of Debbie's Diner hummed with a tired electrical buzz, casting a pinkish glow on the damp pavement. It was neutral ground, a place where truckers and insomniacs gathered over stale coffee and cherry pie. Jack sat in a booth at the back, facing the door. He checked his watch. 44 hours. The bell above the door chimed, and Rick Riley walked in. He looked even more tired than before. He carried a damp umbrella and a heavy conscience. He slid into the booth opposite Jack, the vinyl groaning under his weight. He didn't order anything. He simply placed a clenched fist on the table. I've got a pension, Riley said quietly, not meeting Jack's eyes. I've got an ex-wife in Florida and a kid in college. If I do this, I'm finished in this town. Hayes will have me blacklisted from every security firm on the East Coast. Jack nodded, understanding the cost. He might, Jack agreed, but you'll be able to look at yourself in the mirror. Riley let out a long, ragged breath. He opened his hand. On his palm was a tiny black SD card. It's not just the dog, Riley muttered. The system records audio, too. High-gain microphones for crowd surveillance. Last month, Hayes had a meeting in the garden with the county zoning commissioner. I wasn't supposed to be listening, but I heard everything. Jack picked up the SD card as if it were a diamond. What's on it? He asked. Riley leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. He didn't just bribe him, Callahan. He threatened the commissioner's family. It's all on there, plain as day. Extortion, fraud. The video of him kicking the dog is on there too. Unedited. Shows the girl tripping, shows him striking the animal unprovoked, shows you taking him down like a sack of potatoes. Riley finally looked up, a grim smile touching his scarred lips. It's a silver bullet. You put this in the right hands, and Preston Hayes won't be worrying about a golf course. He'll be worrying about a federal indictment. Jack pocketed the card. He reached for his wallet to pay for his coffee, but Riley stopped him. Don't insult me, the old Marine grunted. I didn't do it for you, and I sure as hell didn't do it for money. He stood, buttoning his jacket. I did it because that little girl reminds me of my own daughter, and because I'm tired of cleaning up after rich men who think they're gods. He paused, looking down at Jack. You're shipping out? 44 hours, Jack replied. Riley nodded, a sharp, respectful salute. Give him hell, Commander. And tell your sheriff to be careful. Hayes bites when he's cornered. With that, the ghost of Crestwood Hills security walked out into the rain, disappearing into the night he knew so well. Jack sat alone in the booth for a moment, feeling the weight of the SD card in his pocket. It was as light as a feather, but it held the power to destroy an empire. He stood, threw a $5 bill on the table, and walked out to his truck. The rain beat against the windshield as he started the engine, but the road ahead was finally clear. He had the weapon he needed. Now all he had to do was pull the trigger before time ran out. The county town hall was a building that smelled of floor wax, old bureaucracy, and the dust of a century's worth of arguments. On this particular Wednesday evening, the air inside was thick enough to chew. Every seat in the auditorium was taken and people stood along the back walls, fanning themselves with pamphlets that promised a golden age of prosperity. On the stage, bathed in the warm glow of spotlights, Preston Hayes paced like a televangelist. He looked immaculate in a navy suit that cost more than most of the farmers in the room made in a year. Behind him, a large projection screen showed a slick rendering of the Vanderbilt Golf and Resort, a sprawling complex of manicured greens and glass clubhouses that threatened to swallow the valley's rustic charm. Preston held up his hands, beaming a smile of pure teeth and confidence. My friends, he boomed, his voice amplified by the sound system, progress is not a monster to be feared. It is a guest to be welcomed. This project will bring jobs. It will bring tourism. It will put our county on the map. All we need is an update to the zoning laws for the Creek Basin. One small signature for one giant future. A murmur went through the crowd. There was hesitation in the room, a collective unease that rippled through the flannel shirts and work boots. Sitting in the front row was Mrs. Gable, the town librarian and unofficial historian. She was a woman in her 80s with hair like cotton candy and eyes that could spot a lie from across the county. She clutched her purse, her brow furrowed at the slick charts Preston was presenting. She represented the town's conscience, wary of change, protective of history, but feeling small against the tide of Hayes's money. But what about the water rights? A farmer shouted from the back. What about those of us downstream? Preston waved the question away dismissively. We have studies that show no impact. None. Now, I've heard the rumors, the nasty whispers about my character these past few days. Let me assure you, these are the desperate lies of people who hate progress. They want to keep you poor. I want to make you rich. He paused for effect, leaning on the podium. The sheriff is here tonight to ensure order, and I expect the zoning board to vote in favor of the future before we leave this room. He reached for the gavel on the podium, appointing himself the right to end the debate. But the gavel never struck the wood. The double doors at the back of the hall didn't just open. They were thrown open with a force that rattled the hinges. The sound echoed through the room like a crack of thunder, silencing the murmurs instantly. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway, framed by the darkness of the night outside, was Commander Jack Callahan. He was in his full dress blues, the brass buttons glinting under the hall lights, his chest heavy with the ribbons that told stories of sand and blood. He didn't look like a man interrupting a meeting. He looked like Judgment Day arriving on schedule. But he was not alone. Flanking him were pillars of the community's true strength. To his left was Sergeant Major Kowalski, retired, in his own formal uniform, his back as straight as a rifle barrel. To his right was Doc Miller, the vet, leaning on a cane but looking more ferocious than a badger. And beside Jack, holding a leash with a quiet, disciplined pride, was Clara. At the end of that leash was Max, the German shepherd. He was no longer the wounded puppy cowering in a bush. He walked with his head held high, ears alert, wearing a vest that marked him as a service dog in training. Preston faltered on stage, his smile dying on his lips. This is a private hearing, he sputtered, his voice trembling slightly. Sheriff, remove these people. They're trespassing. Sheriff Brody, who had been standing in the shadows near the stage, stepped into the light. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. He didn't move toward Jack. He moved toward the stage steps. This is a public town meeting, Mr. Hayes, Brody said, his unamplified voice carrying through the room, open to all citizens, and Commander Callahan has the floor. A wave of astonishment rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Gable sat up straighter, a small smile touching her lips. Jack walked down the center aisle. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. The only sounds were the rhythmic click of his dress shoes and the soft patting of Max's paws. He didn't stop until he was at the foot of the stage, looking up at Preston. "You talk about progress," Jack said, not shouting, but projecting his voice with the command of an officer addressing his troops. "You talk about the future, but you build your future on a foundation of lies." He turned to face the crowd. "This man tells you he cares about this town. He tells you he respects the law." Jack pulled the small black SD card from his pocket. It looked insignificant, a tiny square of plastic, but he held it up like a weapon. "I have proof here that says otherwise. Proof given to me by a man who could no longer stomach the rot." Jack nodded to Clara. She walked to the AV desk where a confused technician sat. "Play it," Clara said softly, setting the card on the desk. The tech looked at Preston, who was screaming, "Cut the power. Cut it now." But the technician, a local boy who'd grown up on stories of Sergeant Major Kowalski, ignored the billionaire and plugged in the card. The screen behind Preston flickered. The slick rendering of the golf course vanished. In its place, a grainy but clear video appeared. It was the garden party. The silence in the hall was absolute. Everyone watched as Clara stumbled. They watched as Preston Hayes, a man twice her size, drew back his foot and kicked a 4-month-old puppy into a rosebush. A collective, horrified gasp sucked the air out of the room. Mrs. Gable covered her mouth with a trembling hand. But it didn't stop there. The audio changed. It was no longer the ambient noise of the party. It was a clear, high-quality recording of a conversation. "I don't care about the zoning laws, Commissioner. You will approve the water diversion or I will make sure your wife finds out about that apartment in the city. And if that old woman on the farm won't sell, I'll bury her in legal fees until she starves." The recording ended. The screen went black. For 3 seconds, there was no sound. Then Mrs. Gable stood up. She didn't shout. She simply turned her back to the stage. Then the farmer next to her stood and turned his back. One by one, row by row, the people of the town stood and turned their backs on Preston Hayes. It was a wall of flannel and cotton, a rejection more powerful than any riot. Preston stood alone on the stage, his face ashen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. "This is doctored," he screamed. "Deepfake AI. I'll sue all of you." Sheriff Brody walked up the stage steps. The apologetic look was gone. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metallic click as he opened them echoed in the quiet hall. "Preston Hayes," Brody said, his voice heavy with the authority of the law, "I have a warrant for your arrest. The charges include animal cruelty, filing a false police report, bribery of a public official, and extortion." He turned Preston around. The billionaire offered a weak resistance, but Brody slammed him against the podium, not with brutality, but with firmness, and cuffed his hands behind his back. "You have the right to remain silent," Brody advised. "And I strongly suggest you use it." As the sheriff led Preston down the steps, the crowd parted again, but this time not with respect, but with revulsion. They stopped near Jack. Preston was disheveled, his tie askew, his eyes wild with panic and humiliation. He looked at Jack, expecting gloating, expecting anger. Jack simply looked at him with the detached calm of a soldier who has neutralized a threat. But it was Max who delivered the final verdict. The German Shepherd walked forward. The leash went slack in Clara's hand. The dog sniffed at Preston's expensive trousers, at the same leg that had kicked him. Preston flinched, terrified the dog would bite. Max paused. He looked up at the man who had hurt him. The dog's eyes were deep and brown, ancient in their understanding. He didn't growl. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply let out a soft huff, turned his head away, and sat down next to Clara, leaning against her leg. It was an act of complete and utter dismissal. He wasn't worth the anger. He was beneath it. "Even the dog pities you," Sergeant Major Kowalski said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Get him out of here, Jim." As the sheriff hauled the sobbing Preston out of the hall, the townspeople turned back around. They looked at Jack, at Clara, and at the dog. Mrs. Gable began to clap. It was not a thunderous ovation. It was slow, steady, and respectful. It grew, spreading from the front row to the back until the old wooden rafters of the town hall vibrated with the sound. It was the roar of justice, not the bang of a gavel, but the unified voice of a community taking back its soul. Clara knelt and hugged Max, burying her face in his fur. Jack put a hand on her shoulder, feeling the weight of the last 48 hours melt away. He checked his watch. He had 12 hours before his flight. He had won the battle. Now he had to go fight the war, leaving behind a fortress that was finally secure. The morning after the town hall victory, the sun rose over Havenwood Farm with an almost cruel brilliance. It was a sharp, golden light that illuminated every blade of grass and every leaf, making the world look too beautiful for a day of departure. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of hay and the distant, earthy smell of the Ohio River, but the usual morning sounds of the farm were muted by a heavy, reverent silence. Jack's truck was idling in the drive, a plume of white exhaust puffing into the cool air. His duffel bag, packed with the precision of a man who lives his life on the move, sat on the passenger seat. He stood by the open driver's door, now dressed in his camouflage utilities, the dress blues packed away for another time. He looked less like the mythical avenger of the night before, and more like what he was, a soldier going to work. Martha stood on the bottom step of the porch, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug she hadn't touched. She wasn't crying. She was a woman of the land, and she knew that seasons turned and men left, and the only thing to do was keep the fire burning until they came home. She gave her son a fierce, bone-crushing hug, whispered a prayer into his ear that only God and the angels heard, before stepping back to give him space with Clara. Clara stood near the hood of the truck, Max sitting at her heel. She looked older than she had just a few weeks ago. The fear that had lived in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet strength, a resilience forged in the fire of the last few days. Jack walked over to her. He didn't touch her face or make a grand romantic gesture. That wasn't his way. Instead, he reached inside his shirt and unclasped the silver chain from around his neck. He pulled it free, the two metal dog tags clinking softly, a sound like tiny bells. He took Clara's hand and pressed the warm metal into her palm, closing her fingers around them. "These have my blood type and my religion on them," Jack said, his voice thick with an emotion he refused to let spill over. "They tell the world who I am if I can't speak for myself. But to me, they just mean I have to come back to get them." He looked at her, his blue eyes intense and clear. "You're in charge now, Clara. The legal papers are signed. You manage the accounts. You manage the land. Don't let the fences break, don't let the fire go out." Clara clutched the tags, feeling the warmth of his skin still on them. "I'll hold the line," she promised, using the phrase he had taught her during their training. "We'll be here. The gate will always be open." Jack knelt one last time before Max. The German shepherd looked at him with soulful, knowing eyes. He didn't whine. He sat up straighter, puffing out his chest as if accepting a transfer of command. Jack placed a hand on the dog's head, rubbing the fur behind his ears. "Watch over them, Max," Jack commanded softly. "You're the man of the house now. Eyes open, ears up." Max licked Jack's hand once, a solemn seal of their pact. Jack stood, climbed into the truck without a backward glance, because looking back made leaving harder, and drove down the gravel road. Clara and Martha watched until the dust settled, and the rumble of the engine faded on the wind, leaving them alone in the fortress of their own making, with only a promise and a dog to keep them warm. The seasons passed like pages in a well-worn Bible. Autumn deepened into a tapestry of russet and gold, stripping the leaves from the oaks and leaving their bare branches against a gray sky. Then came winter, blanketing the valley in silence and frost. But Havenwood Farm did not hibernate. It transformed, using the considerable settlement money paid out by Preston Hayes, who was now facing a federal indictment that would tie him up in court for the rest of his life. Martha and Clara launched the Guardian Project. They didn't buy fancy cars or jewelry. They fixed the barns. They built small guest cabins. They turned the farm into a sanctuary for broken things. It became a therapy center for traumatized children and veterans with PTSD, a place where the wounded could come to heal in the quiet company of animals and nature. Clara, once the frightened server, became the heart of the operation. She managed schedules, finances, and clients with a grace that surprised everyone, including herself. And Max found his true calling. He wasn't just a farm dog. He was a healer. He seemed to possess a sixth sense for pain. One afternoon late in the spring, a new arrival came, a little boy named Leo. Leo was 8, small for his age, with a mop of brown hair and eyes that were perpetually fixed on the ground. He had stopped speaking a year ago after witnessing an act of domestic violence in his own home. For 3 days, Leo sat on the porch swing, refusing to look at anyone. Then Max approached him. The dog didn't bark or jump. He simply walked to the swing, laid his heavy head on the boy's lap, and let out a long sigh. Leo froze, then slowly, hesitantly, buried his hands in the dog's fur. 20 minutes later, Martha watched from the kitchen window, tears in her eyes, as she saw Leo whispering a secret into Max's ear. It was the first time he had spoken in 12 months. Max absorbed the pain of all who came to the farm, acting as a living sponge for their sorrow. Yet he always reserved his final ounce of energy for the evenings, when he would sit at the end of the driveway, looking down the road, and wait. Summer burned hot and bright, bringing fields of wildflowers and the sound of laughter to the farm. But Jack's absence was a constant shadow. Letters arrived sporadically, mails printed on thin, heavily redacted military paper. They spoke of the heat, the sand, the homesickness, but never of the danger. Clara read them aloud to Martha and Max by the fire, tracing the handwritten lines with her finger. Then the letters stopped. September passed. October passed. November brought cold rains and a silence that stretched into a terrifying void. Clara wore the dog tags every day, the metal warming against her skin, a constant, silver prayer. She worked harder, exhausting herself so she wouldn't dream of folded flags and the sound of taps being played. Then came December. The valley was buried under a blanket of snow, so deep and white it looked like a fresh page waiting for a story. It was Christmas Eve. The farmhouse smelled of pine, cinnamon, and roasting turkey. A fire blazed in the hearth, crackling cheerfully, but the mood was somber. A place was set at the table for Jack. An empty chair, an upturned plate, a burning candle. It was a tradition of hope, but tonight it felt like a memorial. Mia sat by the window, watching the snow fall in thick, lazy flakes. Max was restless. He paced between the door and the window, letting out low, impatient whines. "He's just reacting to the barometer," Martha said, trying to convince herself. "The storm's getting worse." But Max wasn't reacting to the weather. He ran to the door and barked, a sharp, insistent sound. Then, through the curtain of snow, headlights cut through the darkness. It wasn't the mailman. It wasn't a guest. It was a heavy vehicle, its engine growling with a diesel rumble. A military Humvee pulled up to the driveway, its tires crunching audibly on the frozen gravel. Clara's heart stopped. She shot to her feet, knocking over her chair. "Martha," she breathed. They both rushed to the porch, throwing the door open to the frigid air. The driver's side door opened. A uniformed soldier got out, but he walked around to the passenger side. He opened the door and offered a hand. A figure emerged. He was wearing desert utilities that looked too thin for the winter night. He had a heavy parka on over them, but it was the way he moved that broke Clara's heart and then put it back together again. He moved slowly. He reached back into the vehicle and pulled out a cane, a stark black metal rod. He planted it in the snow, leaning on it, favoring his right leg. It was Jack. He was thinner, his face gaunt and covered with a thick beard that obscured his jawline, and there was a new scar running through his eyebrow, but his eyes, those fierce, gentle blue eyes, were the same. Max did not wait. He launched himself off the porch, a blur of black and tan against the white snow. Clara gasped, afraid the dog would knock him over in his weakened state. "Max, easy," she cried, but she didn't have to. Max reached Jack and came to an abrupt halt. He didn't jump. He didn't paw. He gently pressed his body against Jack's good leg, looked up, and whined softly, his tail wagging so hard his whole body shook. He made himself a crutch, a living support. Jack dropped his cane in the snow. He didn't need it. He buried his hands in the dog's fur, sinking to one knee, not from weakness, but from gratitude. "I'm home, buddy," he rasped, his voice cracked from disuse and the dry air. "I'm home." Clara ran out into the snow, heedless of the cold, heedless of her slippers. She crashed into him, throwing her arms around his neck, burying her face in the rough fabric of his jacket that smelled of ozone and long flights. Jack held her, his arms strong despite his injuries. Martha followed, her arms enveloping them both, completing the circle. "You're late for dinner," Martha choked out, laughing through her tears. Jack looked up at the women who had guarded his fortress and the dog who had guarded its soul. He reached out and touched the dog tags hanging around Clara's neck. "Told you I'd come back for these," he whispered. The snow kept falling, covering the scars on the land and the scars on the man, making everything clean and white and silent. Inside, the fire was warm. Outside, the war was over. And at the heart of the storm, a soldier, a girl, a mother, and a shepherd stood together, a testament to the truth that love, when disciplined by faith and loyalty, is the only force strong enough to conquer the winter.